Good morning or good afternoon, and welcome to our session today. Our BC Plan webinar is Microcredentials, Research Findings and Learnings. My name is Janet Morris-Reid, and I am the CEO of Aspect BC, which is the Association of Service Providers for Employability and Career Training, and I am also the Vice Chair of BC Plan. I'm joined today with Andrew Skipenko, who is the operations manager of BC Plan and who is responsible for setting up this session today. While I have your attention, I just want to take a moment to tell you a little bit about BC Plan. BC Prior Learning Action Network is a strategic partnership of leaders from the public, private, and community volunteer sectors who have come together to develop a coherent approach to prior learning assessment and recognition for adults throughout BC. If you would like to become a member, you can count on the following benefits: a quarterly newsletter and member rates on BC Plan and CAPLA conferences and symposiums, and an opportunity to serve on the BC Plan Board of Directors or make connections through one of our committees. Our presenter today, we're very honored to have Joanne Duklas. Joanne is an award-winning leader in higher education who leads her own consulting firm providing research and consulting support to governments, institutions, and sector organizations. Her career also includes serving as Vice President and President of ARUCC from 2010 to 2012, as a past member of the 2020-21 TICEP Strategic Task Force, and as a former registrar and assistant vice president at one of Canada's largest post-secondary institutions. Joanne will speak, and she will be fielding her own questions through the chat. So please make sure that you put your questions in. And I also wanted to acknowledge that I am joining you from Victoria, BC, and it is the traditional territories of the Algonquin speaking people, which is made up of the Esquimalt, Songhees, and Waseknek people who have lived in this land forever. And I'm very happy to be here and joining you. If you'd like to take a moment, we're in actually meeting mode. So if you'd like to take a moment to introduce yourselves and to tell us where you're from, please use the chat function. And I now will turn it over to Joanne. So Joanne, welcome.
Thank you so much, Janet. I appreciate you and Andrew helping and having the opportunity to share today. I am going to share my screen. I just want to pre-warn all of you that I do live in the country and I seem to be having some internet issues. So I'm going to turn off my video while presenting, and I've provided the deck to Andrew so that he can distribute it to you afterwards. And hopefully, even if my deck disappears from your view, you'll still be able to hear me, or I'll call back in. So without further ado, let me just make sure you can see my screen. Can you see the slide that says Microcredentials? Janet, can you see the slide?
Yeah, it's loaded now. That's great. Thank you.
So it's a pleasure chatting with everyone today. I am got a bit of an intro, but I think I'm going to also put some color to that. I'm someone who believes very much in student mobility. And so I have dedicated my work and my life to help learners to achieve their dreams. So I do that by working with the government, institutions, and large sector organizations to help them change and improve practice and to move forward in a different way. One resource that may be relevant to this group because of your work is one that I was the lead author and publisher for. That's called the Work Transcript and Transfer Guide. That had 9 funding agencies, including BCCAT, several years ago, and it's still being used by the community today. And it has references in there to things that are related to your world, because we collaborated with the National PLAR Association as well as others to ensure that happens. And so I'm going to take you through some of the walk of life that I've had but with a particular focus on microcredentialing and how it might be a credential that can benefit admissions and transfer assessment. So I intend to sort of set a bit of the context, talk a bit about the problem to solve, some insights, and share some resources for you, some of which you may be familiar with. I'm going to also focus a little bit on a BCCAT study that I did, which was a national look at microcredentialing in Canada. And that's in addition to other findings from other work that I've done. And then we'll talk a little bit about moving forward. I will be keeping my eye on the chat, and hopefully I will be able to cover off all your questions, but I'm also happy if somebody wants to vocalize their questions throughout. So without further ado, a little bit of context setting, and I'm sure none of this is a surprise to you, but it's my personal opinion in part as well as research. I think the microcredentialing discussion is starting to be more mature, where it's becoming part of the mainstream of credentialing. And I think as well, the governments are helping with this, and I know there's quite a bit of work going on in BC around the space. There are concerns. Sometimes we hear academic colleagues or others think that microcredentials are somehow diminishing other credentials, or it's a gig credential for the gig economy. I really don't see these as insurmountable issues. I think they're important conversations to be had, but I think the focus on quality assurance is a really critical one, and some of the work that's happening around the world is a really positive alignment with those pieces. I would also like to suggest to you that I'm seeing the opportunity for access being motivated by more than just acquiring skills for the job market. I'm now seeing that there is more willingness to talk about using these credentials as a way to help provide more informed PLAR as well as transfer assessment, which to me fits with some of my research findings, helping learners frame their work in such a way that they actually might be able to use it for admission and transfer into post-secondary. There is a need to realign practices, and I think I do a lot of work in the digitization sphere. In fact, I am the national executive lead for an initiative called Microcredentials, which is a national network, a highway, if you will, where we're providing digital wallets to learners. And one of the important types of credentials that are featuring in that wallet are badges and microcredentials. And it's a comprehensive way to connect those as well as institutions, organizations, industry, etc., government, to ensure that a learner's mobility is matched by their own document and credential mobility. So it's a very, very important space, and I would like to talk about some of that today. I think at the end of the day, whether it's microcredentials or any other type of credential, establishing trust remains critical. I kind of want to weave that story for you a little bit. There are several studies out there that I'm sure you bumped into. I'm just going to talk about a couple of them. One of them is the good work done by CICAN. They've established a framework, but there's also a report that they've put together that's quite thoughtful. I'm an admirer of Dr. Beverly Oliver's work. I helped her. I was one of the experts that helped her with her proposed definition on microcredentials to help inform UNESCO's work, and I have that example in here. She also did an exemplar work called Making Microcredentials Work for Learners, Employers, and Providers. So I've had the honor to work with her and meet her. We were also on a panel together quite recently at the Groningen Declaration Network Summit meeting in Ottawa. The GDN, as it's known, is an international convening organization out of the Netherlands, a trust. And my company, as well as Rook and a few other schools in Canada, are actually formal signatories to the GDN principles. And this is actually a very important document because it talks about the importance of supporting learners in their places and spaces and providing them with mobility and portability for their credentials and data to help them access cultural and social mobility. I see someone's asking about the slides, and yes, we will be providing the slides after the event. This particular link to this consultation paper is, I co-edited it with Margit Schatzman, who's the president of the ECE, which is a credential evaluation, a highly regarded credential evaluation firm in the US. I do a lot of work with credential evaluators, hence my ongoing membership in the international organization called TISEP. For this particular consultation paper, what we wanted to do was help the European Commission understand the importance of digitization in the sphere of microcredentials as they developed out their definitional work. And it's a paper that I think has been very well received in our work, and I encourage you to have a look at it because we are trying to advance a smoother, frictionless ecosystem of sharing of trusted credentials for our community of learners. And the GDN plays a very important role in that. In addition, I myself have done different studies on this work. ONCAT is like BCCAT, but in Ontario. And back in 2015, I did a case research project and was looking at the good work going on at places like Stanford and other parts of the world to try and understand what organizations, institutions in the day were doing, and to suggest a typology of credentialing options, of which microcredentials were a part. You often hear different terminology used, different intentionality, different types of learning being credentialed. This study from ONCAT looks at some of that. The BCCAT study came out in, I think it was 2020, and that was both a local as well as a national look at just micro-credentialing trends in admissions and transfer, and I'm going to talk about some of those findings in this particular presentation today. These are all publications that are available online, and so you can access the links through the presentation. I think what my particular, I started in this industry in research, and then I moved into actually internet recruitment. I've done all kinds of recruitment and assessment for both domestic and international students, and I've traveled all over the world to support learners. So I have a really intimate, practical understanding of how policy comes into play. Quality assurance comes into play when boots are on the ground and you're actually trying to allow someone to come into your institution or to get transfer. And so this particular overview here looks at the sort of the journey map, shall we say, that people go through when they go through the whole recognition and assessment process. I'm sure that there's always nuances to this. This is intended to be a high level, but it's a really critical one because it kind of gets to the nub of what some of the challenges are. So when you think about a microcredential coming in, usually they're digitized, not always, but they're coming in and arriving. The very first question is, are they even going to look at that document? Are they even going to use it? Do they even understand it? And so that is where you get at the nexus of policy and purpose, trying to understand if you'll even take in an extra document. I can tell you that most institutions, they get a whole array of documents from learners. All they care about is the official transcript and maybe the actual diploma that's come in, as well as the language test results. So they're not even looking at everything else a learner provides. And there's a real sort of barrier in their mind's eye about using other things. I know with PLAR, there's all kinds of wonderful good work going on. And even with organizations such as our military, I know that BCIT, for example, has done some really interesting work mapping the educative process that the military provides and then giving transfer credit for it, etc. So there is some show-star, exemplar opportunities out there that are being realized, but invariably, when things like this come in, they're disregarded. And this first tranche here is called the recognition tranche. Is the provider of the learning experience recognized? Is the learning experience recognized? That a lot of times, if it's non-credit, it's ignored. Is the credential from a trusted source, and did it come through a trusted channel? These days, with digitization, there's all manner of MyCreds, Macertiefs all over the world. You know, you get a document from Australia, it might come from My Equals. You get something from the States, it might come from Parchment, National Student Clearinghouse, etc. You get something from China, it might be from Chesapeake. These are all trusted channels, and they come in different technology formats. So the whole notion of a human readable, and can you work with it? Is it from a trusted source? Is it from a recognized institution? Is it from a program at the institution that's not recognized? Et cetera, et cetera. And micro-credentials are really disrupting this because they're crossing all learning, and it's really challenging us to reach higher. Then comes the pieces about the practices. After figuring out if you're even going to accept this document and this learning from whatever provider by whatever means, then you start asking, are they eligible for admission, and are they eligible for transfer? And then comes the question, was the learner successful, and is the learning experience related to the program of study? At every one of these doors, there's a binary decision to be made. Yes, no, yes, no. You live and breathe that as PLAR experts. You're trying to cut across that with your work. And the kind of work that I do is to try and convince communities that it is okay to accept these alternate learning documents, that they're worthwhile, that they have value, and that they in fact might do a lot to enhance your understanding of an individual's preparedness to do a particular course of study at your institution. So, but there's so many micro barriers here to regular documents, let alone micro-credentials. And because I've done this work before, and I've lived and breathed this assessment practice, I would also like to add, much of that assessment work is guided by best practice conventions and principles and training. And so there's a lot of very well-intentioned people sometimes getting documents in that perhaps they should be paying attention to but aren't, because they simply don't know enough about the learning that was given or where it came from, etc. So it's a bit of a gap here in our community, and there's other studies I've done to try and help close that gap. But this is from the study that I did. And at the end of the day, I always like to remind people that it is people we're trying to help, and so it's worth going the extra mile to try and rethink things. And I think micro-credentials present a really wonderful opportunity for doing that. We have a lot of challenges that micro-credentials really also present that have nothing to do with the learning and the source of the learning. Because they come in a digitized format, they look and feel different. They're coming via different channels and sources, and they contain different information. And as a result, they're using different, what I call trust assurances. So that it makes it harder to actually digest them and understand them. We have emerging new credential types, new nomenclature and definitional frameworks. There's new forms of fraud. People cite the wonders of blockchain as being fraud resistant. Well, actually, you can get a document from a blockchain that is fraud if the original blockchain is fraudulent itself. So quite frankly, technology is not impervious to some of these challenges. And there's also evolving quality assurance frameworks that don't always contemplate micro-credentials as a case in point. And so there's lots of room for opportunity and growth there. I spend a lot of time in the digitization space looking at these things and trying to help the communities come to a better space and place. And that affects all credentials, not just micro-credentials. So lots of interesting challenges there, but at the end of the day, any one of these things can result in trust erosion. So it's something we have to be diligent about and continue to converse and build convening communities to help evolve conversations. So when I look at micro-credentials and admissions and transfer assessment, I really feel that these documents could really help to close assessment gaps. I also think it's not just for admission and transfer into post-secondary. I think it could help with access to regulatory professions. I was asked at a session I did not too long ago, US Immigration was in the room, and they said, Joanne, what should we be doing with these micro-credentials that come to us as a result of us assessing people for status in the US? I said, well, our governments in Canada are spending a lot of money helping to incentivize creation of quality, robust micro-credentials to help with labor mobility. The best advice without knowing your work is don't discount them. Start to look at them and include them in your assessment practice to help with immigration. And why is that? And I put some of the answers here. This is my belief. I mean, more and more they're focused on providing assessed and verified evidence of completion of learning outcomes that are very specific to purpose. They provide a potentially trusted proxy indicator of achieved learning in a quality assured context. And they usually come in a digitized format, which means you can get at more machine readable data about the learning experience, which could enhance automation, scalable assessment, etc. Examples are learning outcomes. When you look at badges and it's a badger platform, such as what we had in our MyCreds Made Certif, there's space to capture things like learning outcomes and skills achieved and what the badge is about. And it comes with the badge as metadata as well. So there's lots of advantages there with these micro-credentials that I don't think we're fully realizing yet, but I think the opportunity is coming even more. So just some sample research, I'll just talk a little bit about BC study. We were looking at what's emerging in terms of micro-credentials in admissions and transfer. We wanted to kind of get a sense of perspectives on what are the motivations, issues, and opportunities for using micro-credentials in admissions and transfer. There was a component of exploring the HR side of things, not enough data on that, and then some recommendations for moving forward. So as a case in point, we have, I like to situate the conversation of micro-credentials in a broader spectrum. You talk about the evolution in the 90s of information and communication technology networks, then we go to Facebook, then we have all kinds of simultaneous innovations. What you're seeing is a rise in the need of multidisciplinary experts, hence the perfect home for a micro-credential to flourish. So it's a very powerful space, and it's matching what's happening in terms of the evolution of technology in our universe. And so I really feel that if you think of the learner as being the driver, micro-credentials can really help with access and mobility. And I see that Hannah says, seems like micro-credentials might be able to effectively streamline alternate RTL processes that currently are more cumbersome to carry out. I could not agree with you more, Hannah. Regardless of the definitions, et cetera, would be a missed opportunity if we don't dive in. One of the things I'm seeing is a lot of fuss around definitions. I've contributed to it as well. I think that'll probably continue as people try and figure out where they fit in their spaces and places. And these are just a sample of some of the definitions. We also have from 2019, Dr. Oliver talked about it being a certification of assessed learning that's additional, alternate, complementary to, or a formal component of a formal qualification, which I think is a really, really powerful statement. And I love the notion of her saying it could actually help to demonstrate achievement of learning outcomes and create credit-bearing micro-credentials that can contribute and mirror the academic standards for target qualifications. And then talking about the duration and effort required by the learner are in keeping with the amount of credit earned in the target qualification. So it's a really rounded definition. I'm sure that others might poke holes into it or what have you, but she did, and as I said, I was one of the experts. She consulted with 40 or 50 experts recently, and we all tried through a sort of a hackathon kind of extended period of time to contribute to creating a definition that might guide UNESCO in their work. Because one of the things I hear from our colleagues from around the world is you can locally develop definitions, but the true value is in creating something that's at a more global level so that we can truly support learners from around the world. So this definition is not necessarily what UNESCO is going to use, but it will inform their thinking because it was really based on creating a whole bunch of minds around a table and helping them come forward. And I really think that the key things are the focus learning, knowing what a learner knows, understands, and can do, clearly defined standards, awarded by a trusted provider, can have standalone value or complement other credentials, and it meets relevant standards. New Zealand has done some really great work in aligning microcredentials to the various levels in their credential framework, which I think is really important and something that governments and large constituents like yourselves can really add value to. When I think of microcredentials, they're not just digital, they can be non-digital. It is important to allow for official verification by the issuer, which is why we're doing the National MyCred Made Certif. I began with that project when it was still an envelope on a piece of paper and we were talking through ideas. And today we now have tens of thousands of learners with virtual wallets. We've got 22 schools launched. We've got whole jurisdictions represented in our community, and we're talking to EPBC. We've got BC schools coming on and others from the rest of Canada. And it's a network of 2 million plus learners who are moving all manner of documents, credit, and credentials around, all in one virtual wallet, including badges, microcredentials, transcripts, academic macro credentials, etc. So the more we can do in the digital space for all documents and all credentials means microcredentials are no longer unique at being digital. There's a true opportunity here. There's certainly evidence rich, and they can be standalone or credit bearing or non-credit bearing or both, very relevant, etc. So this is some of the things I found through my research. It was more validating. I don't think there's anything surprising here. I had suggested a definition that aligns with what I saw in Canada to help move the conversation forward. But these are more like characteristics. So you can see that I've done a lot of work in this space, hence helping Dr. Oliver as well. I think that the other piece that was interesting to me was to just see the different types that are out there. The vertical one to me is interesting, where you can put one credential on top of another, and that's your traditional framework, but you can do that with micro-credentials as well. You also have the industry example ones that are each module is like a peer to the next, but together they make quite a bundle, horizontal stacking. And then there's what I call complementary stacking, and I'm probably an example of that, where I have your regular macro degrees, but I also have some micro-credentials, and I'm actually about to embark on another set of courses where they'll probably give me another one. And it's very focused and specific to the work that I do. So I view those as complementary. They're not necessarily horizontal or stackable. So Taruna has asked a question. Joanne, what are your thoughts and insights on competency-based as a defining characteristic of microcredentials? In my view, MCs based on competencies allow for better stacking and grouping. I would agree with you. I also think that microcredentials, each one is very specific to purpose, and sometimes that means stacking or grouping doesn't happen. However, I think that doesn't diminish that particular microcredential. So it's about that alignment between the competencies of what a learner can know and do, but also what was the purpose of that particular bundle of learning is very, very important. Hopefully I answered that question for you. Did you want to do a follow-up, Taruna? So the next thing I found was very interesting from the work that I looked at across Canada, I don't think it's really changed that much, is that it represented a subset of courses as alongside of or within a degree or diploma program, that it could be from continuing studies, including in partnership with industry, outside the classroom, such as through co-curricular learning, any of the above, etc. And it could really help with that PLAR learning process, because these micro-credentials tended to have a bit more of a systematic assessment methodology, and that could be of value to RPL. There's some interesting, promising models. This list for me continuously grows. I think our Algonquin College is doing some interesting work. I was very impressed with Thompson Rivers with a lot of their work, quite frankly. And one of the interesting things I thought was true was they also have relaxed their residency policy, which can be proved to be quite the barrier to access, etc. New Zealand has, in my book, still has a really fantastic quality assurance framework and credential registry. And I think Europe has done some good work in this space as well, as I've already described. And Credential Engine down in the States is interesting for me. It's a standards body. And what they're trying to do is not define what these credentials are, but more be able to port them by creating standards for moving the data around. It's quite a heavy payload, but it's quite an interesting space and place. And I often like Sumi's definition for microcredentials. So could microcredentials be, Andrew's asking, could microcredentials be tied to blockchain wallets and become a way to bypass the PSE sector and further segment or value the job market? I don't think the academic sector will be bypassed, quite frankly. It's too huge, it's too critical, it's too important. I think blockchain is not unique to microcredentials, and it's not, we're actually in Microcredentials working with extending our existing wallets with this good support of a world leader called Matter Global. We already have a digital wallet. All the credentials from their macro credentials are there. Their letters are there, etc. People are adding badges, etc. But what we're making sure happens is that it's a trusted wallet and that the learner can't alter these things. And when we extend it out and use the verifiable credentials, distributed identity, blockchain, etc., when we extend out that wallet, what that simply means is the learner will be able to consume that wallet into this interoperable one so that they can walk with it more easily wherever they want and have, shall we say, even more control. I really honestly don't think that it will bypass the PSE sector. The space and place that I'm operating in, it's actually, we're embracing it. And we're figuring out how to do it in a way to create sort of a trusted highway so that we can still ensure verification, etc. Did I answer it to your satisfaction, Andrew, or did you want us to do a follow-up? Okay, it is very cool. I work in cool spaces. I talked a little bit about the New Zealand Qualifications Authority. I'll just do a little bit of call out for them as an example. So what they've done, and I've seen this down in the States as well, and I think we're going to see it more here, they actually have identified approved microcredentials, and not all are approved, but the ones that are approved, they have certain parameters that they have decided on, which is their right, like must offer 5 to 40 credits, be closely tied to industry, be reviewed annually, etc., and not duplicate learning. But what happens is you could have a microcredential that's before an academic qualification in terms of level, at the level of a diploma, at the level of an undergraduate degree, at the level of a master's, etc. That's certainly what's happened down in the States, and they do give admission and transfer for these. So once the community figures out which microcredentials are the ones that are supported, and because you can confirm their quality, etc., then you can line them up. Is it at the undergrad level, etc.? And that way it does a lot to help make these credible in the admissions and transfer assessment realm. And in fact, because they come with the detailed information on learning outcomes achieved that's assessed, it's very powerful data to help with informed, scalable admissions and transfer assessment. So one of the things that I looked at closely at the time was microcredentials in Canada, and I don't think this has changed too much based on my recent work. I think the interest continues to grow, but I'm still seeing minimal use of microcredentials in admissions and transfer assessment for access to post-secondary. And I have a discussion question at the end because I'm hoping to find out what you think. Most are not subject to the same quality assurance as what I'll call recognized credentials. I think that gap still needs to be closed. There are very select examples of credit-bearing courses where maybe a component of a microcredential is in fact transcriptable, we call it. It can be on an academic transcript. There are still varied definitions and standards and still varied access. And I think exemplars continue to emerge. So it's really quite interesting. We have found that 1 out of 5 in Canada at the post-secondary institutional level had a working definition at the time. I think that that's improved. At the time, there was 19 offering microcredentials. That has definitely improved. I was talking to one institution where they have 29,000 microcredentials that they are distributing to our students here in Canada, and that's just one institution. It is extraordinary, the number of microcredentials that are now being generated, mostly through Con Ed across the country. And when we did the survey work, a lot of the responses did come from BC and Ontario, which is not surprising, and mostly from universities and colleges, which was our target group, so this is not surprising. But what we found is the source of most of the microcredentials at the time were continuing ed, but program areas weren't far behind. And most were governed by an internal governing body, but not all. Some with staff, or faculty, or course directors, etc. Not a lot were being governed by external authorities, third-party audits or program reviews, etc. Which is, you'd probably see the opposite with some of the other macro credentials. So that's that QA piece I was talking about. So we you know, when you talk, that question you asked me about competency-based, I think these characteristics still exist today. Most would have defined their microcredentials as competency-based, and they saw that the really defining component was shareable in an electronic format. As I explained with the MyCred Masterchief, we have over 160 different digitized document types that our schools have provisioned into virtual wallets for our learners through MyCred Masterchief in Canada. So this notion of shareable and electronic format is not exclusive to microcredentials anymore. The other interesting thing in this study that we did was the different types of learning experiences that are being reflected. I am seeing that in my walk today. You know, these microcredentials are representing all forms of learning, combined learning, hybrid learning, etc. And I think that's really exciting. Makes it harder if you're contemplating using them for PLAR and for transfer, but I think it's more holistic and more reflective of the whole learning individual and not just focused in a micro way on specific things. So then we have motivation. I was really interested to understand motivations. Why are they creating these microcredentials? What was fascinating to me, even though you hear from governments all the time or from institutions, oh, we're creating these for the workplace. That is our motivation. A solid component also say they're creating these to provide access to further education. If that is your motivation, if it's a dual motivation, then why wouldn't you design a microcredential with admissions and transfer assessment in mind, in addition to upskilling for the workplace? It just seems logical to me. That's your motivation, then that's how I would design them. So I'm just taking a quick look at the question here from Taruna. She says, I see value of embedding MCs in the existing formal qualifications level because it allows people to explore alternate pathways to get to the credential and get their recognition for their knowledge gained outside of a formal zone. And then you talk about competency-based MCs, a national framework, which we lack in Canada, providing the necessary foundation. I think the how is probably subject to a lot of debate, but I do agree with you that it's embedding the MCs in the existing qualification frameworks, assuming you have one, is actually a very strong thing to do. You don't want to lose the flexibility and the nimbleness, but there's ways and means of figuring this out and doing it because others have done it before us. So the other thing that I think was really interesting, I asked at the time, are you using this for admission and transfer? And to be honest, most were not using it. Only a small, tiny subgroup were even using it. I think that if I was asked that question today, I think that's starting to shift, which is a great. We also had, I asked for transcription samples, and very few were provided. I think if I was to ask today, most would show me, oh yeah, this course of this part of the microcredential is transcripted, or we've transcripted it over here in ConMed, but it's not on the credit-bearing one. So this nut needs to be cracked a little bit, or at least greater transparency about the nature of assessment and the quality of learning that was experienced are important things to do to help with recognizing that credential. But I also think it's contributing to the rising importance of continuing education and their practices. For the work we're doing nationally, I'm in conversations with Modern Campus, which owns Destiny One. And what we're doing is talking with them about setting up connectivity between their platform and the national network that we're creating. And I think that will continue to further advance the profile of continuing education type microcredentials, in addition to regular microcredentials done on the academic side. And I think that's a good thing, because I think that will help us, if we're willing to embrace it for RPL and transfer. So Andrew asked, what is the intersection between microcredentials and the co-curricular record? I will give you my biased opinion, and that is that learning is learning, non-formal, informal, and formal learning. And co-curricular learning, as it gets transcripted on a co-curricular record, is demonstrating a form of learning. Now, it could have been self-assessed by the learner, or it could have been assessed by a faculty member or staff. These are the questions that need to be transparently evident in the information that wraps the credential, so that an institution or organization that's receiving it can actually look at it and make a judgment call on if it aligns with their practice and policy at their institution. So that's just some thoughts around that. I asked if there was plans to adopt microcredentials, and at the time there was quite a few, but there was also a lot of people who were quite vague about it. So I think that that's shifted, obviously, with incentive funding from government, hence why we're even doing today's session, and that's a good thing. It's also shifted in other parts of the world, which is why Beverly Oliver did her work, where I've done my work through GDN, et cetera. People are embracing this new form in a big way, which is good. I see a comment from Deb in the chat, Deb Carr in the chat, that says she recently attended a conference and they warned of setting restrictive standards for MCs at the risk of reducing flexibility, which seems to be endemic to, I'm going to paraphrase. I'm interested in your view on this, and you have quite a bit in here about three broad MC standards like RPL friendliness, competency-based learning, assessed in a quality assured framework, etc. There's a lot there for me to respond to, Deb, but what I'll narrow and focus on is I actually think that making sure a credential is backed by quality doesn't necessarily equate to reducing flexibility. There are ways and means of streamlining that are principles-based and broader standards-based that I think actually can result in quite a lot of innovation. And I often point to the graduate level. I mean, you have the Credential, you have all kinds of really interesting graduate level programs, and yet they're so heavily quality assured, and look how creative they are. So our academic colleagues and others have the capacity, I think, to keep going and being flexible. And I don't think ensuring that the assessment is quality-based is going to take that away. So I think what they're really saying is a lot of QA approval processes are elongated, have a lot of review elements to that, take longer time, and that's probably where there's some concerns about nimbleness and flexibility and so on. I think that's a call to make the QA processes as streamlined as you can and as focused as you can, so that they're not so onerous for the community. Because I personally think there's a lot of heavy lift there. So there's a couple of things. I'm going to keep going forward because of time. So I have some concluding thoughts. I think that we still need to recognize that these MCs are really new, that an opportunity exists to more closely align intentions for these MCs with opportunities. Remember what I said? The motivation was not just upskilling for work, but also access to education. Then logically, why wouldn't you design microcredentials with both those motivations in mind? It seems kind of obvious. I mean, I keep going back to school. Others are probably doing it too. I just get it in different spaces and places. The other thing that I have suggested is, and I'm seeing, credential registries like what we're doing with Microcredentials and Certif. It is becoming a trust registry for credentials and documents that is actually very, very critical. Communities of practice, your group is a very critical group. Aligning microcredentials with existing recognition of prior learning processes. Maybe there's a way to stop doing heavy lift, busy work. Maybe you can adopt a microcredential that if you have this, Sam will do that. I met with a gentleman from NATE who's working on a project where they actually can do self-assessment and allocate, see how they score. And with NATE doing the assessment, they actually can in a very scalable way, either award a microcredential or direct them to a course or a directed plan of study. It's very interesting work. I'm quite intrigued by it. Very scalable. There's a few other pieces in here, and I think the partnership with industry can't be unsaid. It's very important in this work. These are just some sample design questions from the study. You know, who's validating it? Where does it come from? Is it credentialed? What's the nature of assessment, etc. I think the key piece in this fundamental design question section here is about the notion of, again, I go back to admissions and transfer being part of the design stage. And I go back to the design story about the header here. I'll fix that before I send it. But I go back to what I said before. Let's not forget about all the different binary decisions that are made at the micro level at every step of the way. We cannot underestimate the unintentional or intentional barriers to using microcredentials for admissions and transfer. Just getting them in the door is the first challenge. And so policy needs to play an important role here, and there needs to be a lot of lift work to make this happen. The other thing that I think is really important to keep working with the coalition of the willing and informed, getting evidence, adopting shared principles, understanding the learner and assessor journey maps to understand the human experience in the world of assessment as it relates to microcredentials and how might digitization or not inform it, etc. I do have on page 39 in the BCCAT study sort of a suggested implementation checklist to help those that are thinking of creating microcredentials. And it's intended, it's based on best practice advice from the communities across Canada. And I essentially just curated and refined some of the suggestions so that a school could just like start to check things off. I do have questions on my mind about, will it change the practice of assessment for admissions and transfer? And what does this mean for credential evaluators like those in your schools and at TISAT? And I thought perhaps I would pause here. We're at 10:02. I don't know if we have time for questions, Andrew, and if we have time for questions, Janet and Andrew, but I am to have some suggested discussion ones here.
Yeah, we've got about 5 minutes. So if there's any questions, you can put them in the chat, but you can also just put your hand up and unmute yourself if you like.
So I see a comment in the chat here from Annie about high school counselors who are super keen on awarding credit for such experiences at the high school level. You're probably familiar with the dual credit model, where you take a course and it applies both to post-secondary as well as a high school diploma. So some of that is happening in the context of that vehicle. But I do think it does suggest some interesting opportunities there. I think AP is an advanced placement and international baccalaureate and so on. These different credentials come with a lot of, they're not as micro as a micro-credential. They're much more robust. And I say robust not to be disparaging. I mean, there's just more hours of learning, more assessment, et cetera, with the IB and the AP and so on. So yes, they get a lot of transfer credit for those type of programs. But I think the concept that you raised, Annie, is an interesting one. Any other questions or comments? I mean, can I ask you a question? Is anybody doing assessment, and are you using micro-credentials to help you with admission to college or university using those credentials? Anybody? Can't see you, so you're going to have to vocalize or put it in the chat. Is there a yes out there?
Actually, if you stop sharing your slideshow, you'll be able to see everybody. Everybody put your camera on so you can answer without speaking.
Anybody doing this, or is this so new still? Anybody thinking of doing this? Considering that at several Ontario universities do not accept PLAR credits as transferable credit, if micro-credentials appear as different on a transcript, is there the potential for it to limit portability in different provinces? Can you clarify what you mean, Andrew? Sometimes it's hard for me to follow in a chat.
I guess I'm just like, I hope my thing is loud enough here.
Yep.
I guess just going through different universities and looking at their policies around PLAR, it's like many universities won't accept, they don't assess PLAR, and they won't, well, maybe not many, but a few. And so I guess the way that they would assess that is because like a student would have a transcript and some of the credits would be like T instead of a GPA. So I'm just wondering, if you had micro-credentials on a transcript, would that limit the student in terms of transferable credit? Or is it that this is going to be such a big thing that those institutions are limiting themselves, or we just don't know yet?
You know what? There are already things on a transcript that cause elimination. Repeated courses, different grade notations, the list goes on. And often the people that are doing the assessment could be very, very different than perhaps those that have the expertise to look at what that micro-credential could offer from a learning outcome. Like, they're not program mappers, shall we say, of learning outcomes. So I think that where I see some real energy opportunities, let's say there's two institutions that want to prove out a case for using micro-credentials for admissions and transfer. Then you could actually co-develop a methodology, approach, etc., with high-level academic colleague support, as well as support of the registrar, shall we say, or the admissions lead, to actually say, okay, we've mapped this. And in BC, you have a lot of committees that are involved in BCCAT for curriculum mapping. Seems like a logical space in place to raise some of these conversations. But I do think that proving out some of these opportunities might be really helpful, because part of it is educating the people who are receiving these documents as to what it means. I see sometimes across Canada, people don't even know what an associate degree is, right? Or they don't know what the DEC is from Quebec, et cetera, et cetera. So even with regularized programs, they run into some challenges. So I think there's a lot of good focus in BC right now on micro-credentialing, and I see that as an opportunity moment for all of you. I'm seeing opportunities for RPL, for admission. I'm just thinking about the different packages of learning that we could consider as alternative pathways. MCs could be part of that and would need buy-in. Totally agree with that. In Ireland, our MCs are on the NFQ, so they are used for admission into programs of the higher ed. And if the MC does not have credits, then it would be assessed by a non-formal learning. We might, Deirdre, be able to learn from Ireland and your work to help give some ideas. I recommend that maybe you present on what's going on in Ireland, because that's kind of unique and special. Some here are also talking about creating a common framework. I think we're going to be working hard for many years to create common frameworks. We still haven't done that in Canada yet, totally. But I do think it's worth doing, because I've learned the hard way that words matter, and not all words mean the same word means the same to everybody. So I do think if you're going to do this work, you have to think carefully, not only about motivations and structure, but about terminology. For example, I sit in so many meetings and they say, well, is a badge a microcredential? Right? And it goes on and on and on. And I'm like, I'm of the view, a microcredential is a nice holistic title. A badge is a subtype of a microcredential. A skill stamp is a subtype of a microcredential. I could go on, but I think sometimes we do get caught up in all of that. And I think that's just because there needs to be sort of a roadmap that everybody's comfortable with when they're putting these in place. And that's really what you're trying to do, is just create common language. I see some great things in the chat. In Australia, the vet sector treated the same as other non-formal evidence, rules of evidence, etc. CAPU's embarking on a new PLA process. This is all good stuff. I think you could probably, Andrew and Janet, you could create a couple of sessions out of this, having some people come forward to showcase their work. Just all around the piece about advancing admissions and transfer with micro-credentials, and just seeing the different models that are out there. I think I'm almost at my time. I would like to pause and hand it over to Janet.
Great, thank you so much. Thanks very much, Joanne. And as Andrew H. said, this is so cool. That I'm going to definitely check out the checklist that you included in your BCCAT research, and we will be sending out the recording of this session as well as the slides. And I also see Andrew asked about the chat history. We can do that as well, Andrew, so thank you for that request. An impressive body of work, Joanne. Thank you so much. And Joanne actually did bring it up. It would be interesting to hear from others of you. And yes, please do. We are looking for others to host webinars and discussion groups. So please email us at info@bcplan.ca, and Andrew will set something up for you. We've got a presentation form that you can fill out, and it would be really great to hear from you. Also, I wanted to acknowledge verbally Andrew Skapenko, who is our operations manager, and thank you to him for setting this all up and getting it all sorted for us. He's also created some other resources on our BC Plan website. We have a new podcast as well as other resources. And then coming up very soon is the BC Plan holiday social. We're going to be doing some speed networking, and that'll be taking place on December 14th at lunchtime. So please register. Andrew's just put the link in the and the podcast link in the chat. Thank you everybody for spending time with us today. And again, thank you to Joanne. Such great information. I'm just blown away. Thanks everybody. Have a good rest of your day. Bye-bye for now. So Andrew, I'll edit and convert the recording. I didn't record Joanne's introduction, so I wanted to record that again and then put a slide for the session. And okay. I will send that to you tomorrow.
Sounds good. That works. Yeah.
And then also along with the chat text, and you have the slides. I think Joanne said she's going to update that one slide where the heading was off. Yeah. And yeah, sounds good.
That sounds good. Another good webinar.
Oh, I'm blown
was
away.
awesome.
I'm
Yeah.
absolutely blown away.
Yeah.
She really brought it all together for us, didn't she?
Yeah. Joanne is awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, sounds
Good
good
work.
then. Yeah, thank you. Good hosting as well.
Thank you.
Okay, sounds
All
good.
right. Take
See you
care.
on the
Bye.
14th. Bye, Janet.
Okay. Bye for now.